Good day. In these two brief talks, I'd like to review a few of the leading theories of censorship and book banning, and combine them with a short overview of censorship history in colonial America and the United States. The first talk will take us as far as the Federalist period by way of European history. The second talk will deal with the 19th and 20th century United States and its use of censorship. Perhaps the leading theory to authorize censorship in the United States has been the claim of protection of morals. This is a theory with ancient origins, identifiable as far back as Plato's Republic. In Book 2 of the Republic, Plato writes, quote, "And shall we just carelessly allow children to hear any casual tales which may be devised by casual persons, and to receive into their minds ideas for the most part the very opposite of those which we would wish them to have when they are grown up? We cannot. Then the first thing will be to establish a censorship of the writers of fiction, and let the censors receive any tale of fiction which is good, and reject the bad. And we will desire mothers and nurses to tell their children the authorized ones only. Let them fashion the mind with such tales, even more fondly than they mold the body with their hands. But most of those which are now in use must be discarded." Plato provides both educational and civic rationales for censorship. He argues that literature is a means of shaping minds, and as such, only good literature can be allowed. Because the literature that education employs shapes future adult citizens and society as a whole, immoral literature must be prohibited in order to protect society. Like many censorious critics since, Plato believed that most popular stories were so much trash. Later, in Book 10 of the Republic, Plato entirely condemns poetry as a source of corruption and demands its suppression. Poets were to be exiled as subversives. Plato writes, quote, "We shall be right in refusing to admit him," that is a poet, "into a well-ordered state, because he awakens and nourishes and strengthens the feelings and impairs the reason. As in a city when the evil are permitted to have authority and the good are put out of the way, so in the soul of man, as we maintain, the imitative poet implants an evil constitution, for he indulges the irrational nature which has no discernment of greater or less, but thinks the same thing at one time great and another small. He is a manufacturer of images, and is very far removed from the truth." So, Plato begins by demanding a little censorship for the good of children and their education, and then demands massive censorship, expulsion of poets, and complete control over artistic expression. This underlines another point the theories of censorship need to address. Establishment of censorship regimes leads to maintenance, escalation, and genre expansion of censorship demands. In short, one act of censorship authorizes not just the next, but many more. From Plato to civic vice leagues active in many U.S. cities in the 19th and early to mid 20th centuries, censorship represented a tool of social cleansing. Book banning was a means of striving towards a perfected civil society, one where constituted state authority was respected in word as well as in deed. But does the relationship that Plato posited between words and deeds, the foundation of what we call moral protection theory, hold true? If we read dirty words, are we dirty-minded people inclined towards dirty acts? Or, to address another common concern today, if we watch violence in a film, a TV program, or a video game, are we more likely to engage in violence ourselves, or will our children? Such relationships remain very heavily argued and highly tendentious, subject to empirical claims from both sides of the argument. The issue here is not to decide such arguments, but rather to underscore how a hypothesized correspondence between words and deeds generates impulses to censor and ban texts, films, artworks, and much more. One contemporary theory of censorship attempts to explain this problem. The third-person effect explains censorship by using the following conceptual logic. First, people overestimate the effect that persuasive communication has on others. And two, any effect that the communications achieve may be attributed not to the individual recipient, but also to that individual's belief that the communication is having an effect on others. Thus, three, the greatest effect of communication is not on me or you, but on them. So, finally, four, people believe that pornography or violence in public expression do not affect them, but do affect others who must be protected. This explanation translates moral protection theory into neutral terms and expresses it as contemporary communications theory. Other theories of book censorship argue that the drive to censor focuses especially on children's literature, not only to guard children, but to protect parents' sense of what it is to be a child, an innocent. Thus, censorship is directed at protecting the inner child of adults. Another theory is that censorship emerges from social fear. Conservatives might fear the conflict between religion and science and so attempt to censor evolution theory, or fear sex and try to prevent representations of sexuality. Liberals, on the other hand, might fear the effects of racism and sexism and so try to censor or ban literature that exhibits these features. Closely related to but distinct from moral protection theory is religious censorship. This type of censorship and book banning alleges that the text or image constitutes an offense against divine authority. Thus, suppression by a censor seeks to prevent either initial appearance or repetition of blasphemy or heresy. Such censorship typically relies on claims of violated religious sensibility and disturbance of a divinely created order. This category created an extensive religious censorship system throughout medieval and early modern Europe, one that originated in the early Catholic Church's search for heresy. As early as 324 in the Common Era, the Council of Nicaea demanded that heretical Arian, A-R-I-A-N it's spelled, texts be burned, and later medieval heresy cases such as Abelard, John Wycliffe, and Jan Hus were connected with the suppression of their writings. Church censorship extended to Jewish texts, particularly the Talmud, which was regularly collected and burned. All of these were seen as instances of Satan's appearance on earth, and so censorship, which was more often very simple book burning, was a means of cleansing and sanctifying society. The papal bull of Innocent VIII in 1487, which sent inquisitors into Germany in search of witchcraft and led to the murder of hundreds of thousands of largely women as witches, equally provided authority to churchmen to exercise control over the new technology of the printing press invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the early 1450s. The papal bull of Alexander VI in 1501 extended censorship throughout the territories of the church, and local bishops became the primary censors. Writings by Protestants were among the early targets of church censorship. The works of Luther, existing in future, were banned in 1520. By the 1540s, when the Inquisition was organized, the church established at its Council of Trent the first of several indices of prescribed texts, the Index Tridentinius. It came to be called, administered from Rome by a special congregation of the Index. This index became a feature of Catholic intellectual life until the repeal of the index at the end of the 19th century, and the tasking of church censorship largely to theological works. Much classic 17th through 19th century European literature was condemned. Milton, Montaigne, and Voltaire, of course, but also Richardson's Pamela, Swift's Tale of the Tub, Stern's Sentimental Journey, which was condemned not for its content but for its translator, Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, and all of the works of Stendhal, Zola, and Alexandre Dumas, both father and son, by the way. Catholicism was not the only religion with censorship and book banning practices, of course. Some Jewish religious communities, for example, engaged and continue to engage in similar practices until the present day. But what the Catholic Church did was establish censorship and banning mechanisms, including prior review and restraint, using specific rules. First, centralized information and decision-making, second, and bureaucratic institutionalization, third. And these provided models for censorship as censorship shifted from religious to secular rationalizations. The Hayes Office, which censored films in the United States from 1930 to 1968, had very different purposes from the Congregation of the Index, but its censorship model was strikingly similar. A similar structure is also visible in contemporary state-run internet censorship organizations. So this model came to have great influence as an institution. Censorship in the United States began with religious censorship. In colonial America, censorship arrived with Puritan settlement in Massachusetts. Although the Puritan elders objected vigorously to censorship of their texts by the Church of England, the General Court of Massachusetts required the grant of a license, much as in Catholic states, to all printed materials in order to ensure that they conformed to religious doctrine. Only in 1662, more than 2 generations after the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1620, did the court grant permission for publication of positions of which it disapproved, in this case over theological questions concerning entitlement to baptism. Despite religious censorship, the booksellers of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia carried materials that were provocative by the standards of the day. Authorities regularly inspected shops, particularly printing presses, for unlicensed publications. In 1668, the first recorded American case involving censorship for sexual content occurred, this being the confiscation from a Massachusetts printing shop of an unlicensed text entitled Isle of Pines, Henry Neville's novel that tells the adventures of a seaman marooned on an island with 4 women, by whom he produced a total of 565 children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. There are only 2 printers in the colony, Samuel Green and Marmaduke Jones, both working under heavy supervision in Cambridge. When the Massachusetts General Court sentenced Jones to a £5 fine, they effectively threatened to put him out of business and turned him into Samuel Green's junior partner. Well, despite occasional morality scares orchestrated by Puritan ministers and the revivalist successors, during the 18th century, censorship in colonial America and then the newly independent United States increasingly focused on maintenance of Crown authority and then secular state issues under the early Republic. The John Peter Zenger trial of 1735 was a definitive moment in opposition to royal censorship. Zenger, publisher of the New York Weekly Journal, used his newspaper as a forum to criticize the colonial governor, William Cosby, who had Zenger charged with seditious libel. Zenger's attorney, Alexander Hamilton, to make a name for himself later, made a then radical argument that citizens possessed an inherent right to criticize their government. Quote, "It is not the case of one poor printer, nor of New York alone, which you are now trying. No, its consequence affects every free man that lives under British government on the main of America. It is the cause of liberty." End quote. Now, the jury agreed with this defense and found Zenger not guilty. When Americans established their own government under the 1789 Constitution and the 1791 Bill of Rights, they proved themselves little better than the colonial British, despite the existence of the First Amendment guaranteeing free speech. The Sedition Act of 1798, enacted under John Adams and his Federalist government, limited speech as severely as the colonial crown government attempted, perhaps even more so. The act provided that, quote, if any person shall write, print, utter, or publish scandalous and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States or either House of Congress of the United States or the President of the United States, end quote, in order to, quote, excite against them, unquote, then they could be imprisoned for 2 years and fined $2,000. The Sedition Act was one of the lowest points in the history of U.S. free speech. Newspapers were suppressed, hundreds were imprisoned and fined for voicing opinions, including one U.S. congressman jailed for criticizing Adams. And the laws on popularity contributed to the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1802. Jefferson pardoned all those imprisoned under the act, and the Congress, which had changed hands, voted to repay fines. So from the very early days of the American Republic, then, the country was not nearly as free as some forgetful political rhetoric prefers to suggest. In the second lecture, I shall discuss some of the ideas and historical practices informing censorship from the 19th century into the contemporary era.